Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Roll for Combat Live. And just like on most of the times when Steven is not there that day, we have another unusual situation where there is some significant news from the world of Wizards of the Coast that we probably want to cover today. So before we get into how to make sure your monsters are interesting, despite the fact that you have so many constraints at your game and at your table, we are going to talk about what happened with Project Sigil, or Sigil, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I know that if they wanted to name it after the City of Doors, there were definitely sometimes
I think they would have been more. I think they would have been more explicit.
Yeah, there's sometimes that's been pronounced sigil with a hard G, even though I've heard the word sigil as like what the actual English word is, like 90 some percent of the time. It may have been in like voice acting for Planescape Torment or something like that. Not sure.
Oh, I can tell you where this comes from.
Where does it come from?
I believe the voice. If there was voice acting in Planescape Torment, it probably did say sigil, but the sigil pronunciation is correct. The player's primer to the Outlands box set came with a CD that had pronunciation guides on it for all of the gate towns and some other things in the setting. And so according to the official box set player's primer to the Outlands pronunciation guide CD, sigil is the correct pronunciation for the City of Doors.
There you go. That's probably where I got it from them. I knew that younger Mark, who had all the Planescape stuff, knew that the city was pronounced sigil, even though like pretty much no one in human existence pronounces like the general word for a glyph as sigil instead of sigil. And so I always
that's because the city and the word are distinct things.
Yeah, of course. So whether the project is named after the city or the word is unclear. And I guess
I think probably it wasn't.
Yeah, I've heard it usually pronounced sigil for the project, so I think you're probably right. Regardless of that fact, in news that is honestly very sad for the programmers, who, as far as I could tell, are like gamers and nerds who love this stuff and wanted to make a good like 3D virtual tabletop that even like Steven and Professor Dungeon Master liked when they looked at the demo. Unfortunately, Project Sigil is basically kaput. They've lost 90% of their staff. And when I first saw that, it didn't say that it was canceled. So that led me to understand, based on my own experience in the tabletop industry, I've been around things before where you lose 90% of your staff, and that usually either means that maybe it's in maintenance mode while they're trying to shop it around with the remaining 10% of the staff. Maybe they're going to rehire cheaper staff for the remaining staff. Maybe they're going to quietly kill it. But Rascal News got a hold of the internal communication that was being sent within WoTC, and if you want to read it entirely, you can go there. You have to pay for the article or a subscription. But the basic gist is that at least if their message to their own internal staff is to be believed, which I'm going to say is pretty credible. Obviously, yes, corporate could like make things up and not tell the whole story there. But their intent is to fold in existing features of Project Sigil/Sigil into D&D Beyond. And that's why they kept like a few people, like 10% of their staff, in order to make sure that they didn't lose what they had already created and just kind of freely gonna add it onto D&D Beyond. Now, that may turn out to be a project that requires more than 10% of their staff, and that they eventually give up on doing that, and it becomes the option 3 of the 3 options I stated before, where they quietly kill it over time. But that seems to be at least their stated intent within the company.
Yeah, pretty unfortunate news. I know that it was a pretty ambitious VTT compared to other options, considering that it was like an entire 3D thing, but it's not completely dissimilar from the Neverwinter Nights level creator. Like in concept,
That's true.
that you're creating 3D environments for your friends, and then running them through the 3D levels that you created. That is kind of what online Neverwinter Nights servers is what a lot of them were doing.
I think that's true. I think that that's kind of the same energy they probably wanted to create, was like a modern version of that everybody could use at their D&D tables, and that they could have lots of microtransactions and create a like a monetization and revenue scheme for. And then the problem, it seems like, is just that there was a lot of management issues, although, of course, some of the sources for that are people who were on the engineering team I mean, I've been the person who's the equivalent on the person on the engineering team, and I know that from our perspective, sometimes everything does look like managing issues. We don't see all the things that are going on up there, and to be honest, even if we did, maybe we would still think it was managing issues. But the perspective that we have at least makes it seem like, like the upper executives were just like hands off until they weren't, when they finally heard about it. And we already knew during the whole OGL crisis and other times that like there wasn't a lot of good inter-team communication between like Sigil team, the D&D Beyond team, and the actual book team that was making the products. And in fact, like, there's the maps that our D&D Beyond already has, like the simple little VTT that they did release, and apparently one of the people in Project Sigil did not know that that was a thing until they accidentally signed up for a like the beta test for it, thinking it was something for their own project, and they're like, wait, there's this other thing. So yeah,
it's also, I guess, a bit odd to be creating two VTTs at the same time, which it sounds like they were.
yeah, I mean, I get it. One of them was a very stripped down basic thing that would just let you get your game done, and the other one was the posh 3D, everything looks great but probably takes more effort VTT. To be honest with you, I would be someone who would use the maps more than the posh looking one, because I'm whatever the opposite word for a graphics snob is. The graphics snob is obviously a negative connotation word for someone who is just like, no, my video games have to have all of the resolution and all of the graphics such that it will break even the best possible current graphics card, or if there's 1 pixel less, then it's garbage. And for me, I'm just like, I actually actively dislike that and prefer it to be simpler. So come up with a pejorative word for that. I'm okay with self-labeling with it, because I know it's mean to call people on the other side of graphics snob.
Yeah. I'm very sad for this news, and I'm sad for what it means for everyone who was on a project that seemed really cool.
Yeah.
And it's really worrisome that the layoffs are becoming more frequent and happening multiple times a year.
It's like back in the day. Like, that was like the known industry wisdom, right?
Yeah.
Back in the day was just like, you have 2 choices. Back in the day, you could go, assuming you were so great that anybody would hire you, which obviously you usually have 0 choices, okay? But assuming that you could go wherever you want, you could go like to WoTC, which, pays twice as much as Paizo back in the day, and play the Christmas layoff roulette, where you would just have a very high chance of being laid off. Or at Paizo or another company like that, where you make half as much, but they will not. They will very, very unlikely to lay you off. It's more likely you'll get burnt out or leave on your own. And
the differences between the two seem like they're getting more pronounced than they were even back then, because it's not just Christmas layoffs anymore. Like, it's March now, and like, you thought you were safe 2 months ago, but surprise, your department is basically gone now. And then on the other side, the contrast of the job security at Paizo is more pronounced now too, with the union.
And the percentage of salary is better than 50 with the union. So things actually, there was a time of a dip where on the Paizo side, where Paizo was still paying probably half as much as WoTC. This was before the union, except for that WoTC hadn't done any Christmas layoffs in a while. Like, there was a small mini generation of 5e players who joined in after the most recent Christmas layoffs before that, and then never lived through a Christmas layoff until the recent one that hit a few people within the D&D team and a lot of people across WoTC and Hasbro. Yeah. And then, so those players who had played for that number of years, I think it was like close to a decade. That's pretty good by WoTC standards for not doing that.
Yeah.
They just didn't know.
They'd also, but they'd also downsized the D&D team so much at the beginning of 5e too. Like, they weren't even producing their own adventures. They had Kobold Press producing 5e adventures for a little while. So, like, there was a period of time where no layoffs were happening, but there was also no one to lay off for a lot of that period too.
For the beginning of it, that certainly made it easier because they had a skeleton crew, and it turns out if you cut off the femur of a skeleton, then it collapses. And so they were certainly not going to lay off a skeleton crew. But they did grow during that time.
Yes.
And then not fire people for... I want to give them the minute amount of credit, even though obviously, the execs have made a lot of bad decisions. A lot of the time, for some reason, there was some period of time where they weren't doing what they normally do. Yeah. Where the scorpion was saying, okay, frog, take me across the river. I won't sting you. And then they didn't for a bit. But they're back to being the way that they've kind of been known to be in the past. And... like, I guess it's not a WoTC or a Hasbro specific thing that once the executives decided that this project was a project that they didn't like and canceled it, that they fired the people on that. Probably most companies would have done that. Not like the really nice companies that a lot of people want to work at, where they're like, no, we'll find you another project. We'll do something else. But I think most companies probably would have. Not that it's good. It's actually terrible. It's an indictment of most companies.
In video games especially, this is really prevalent. Like, you put everything that you have into your game ships, and now the project is done, so goodbye.
We only need the people left over to do maintenance and carry updates and maybe do some DLC or something else like that. Yeah, that's the video game way in general. Yeah. And if the project looks like it's not going to work, then they get rid of them. And honestly, there have been people who have been predicting that something like this might happen just based on the strangely bad marketing for the release of Project Sigil. That the thought was that they were going to just put it out so that they could have it out and use its failure as a write-off. And that if they had been planning on anything else, then it made no sense for how poor the marketing was on the release. It was hard to find that it came out.
Yeah, I feel like me saying, oh, this sounded sick, it sounds exactly like what Neverwinter Nights Online, not the MMO, but the playing Neverwinter Nights Persistent Worlds on Neverwinter Nights 1. Like, this sounds like what that used to be. That seems like an unpopular opinion of it. Like, it seems like a lot of people's take was that you can't run this on anything other than a gaming PC, and why are you using a gaming PC for a TTRPG?
No, I get it. I completely understand that take. I don't think that was a wrong take by any means, that the people had that. I just think that, I just think it's very unfortunate all around. And hopefully it doesn't spell like a domino effect for anything else. I think that it probably might not. Like, Wizards has other things that they're working on. They have other plans. They're still, like, doing this Netflix deal, right, for more D&D based shows that are going to be on there. The D&D movie has been doing well on streaming services, even though maybe it didn't do it in theaters. So I think there's still legs out there for other things. But because if this did lead to a broader downturn overall for D&D, that often does not necessarily like raise the sales of third parties as much as it should. That being said, recent Kickstarters for non-D&D games have been up, so we could be entering a different era. and that's very unclear. So yeah, I guess that's basically it on Project Sigil. This is not like a rumor. This is not a maybe. We have postings from like people like Andy Collins from Wizards who are just like, yeah, I was laid off, and so was 90% of the staff. There's sources that Rascal and other people have, articles on EN World. Like, this is something that really happened and that it's important to know about. All right, so mini topic over. Now we're going to tell you how to make sure that your monsters are interesting. And of course, in classic fashion, when I was like to Steven, let's do something about like make your monsters interesting, or maybe are your monsters interesting? And so he gave me a really cool looking thumbnail that said, as you've all seen because you clicked on it, why your D&D monsters are not interesting.
Yeah.
Note that it of course added D&D into it because of course, and that it said that your monsters were not interesting. So you know what? Your monsters probably might be interesting. And even if they're not, I bet that they could be with a very small amount of effort, despite what the thumbnail said. And these tips are important for any rules-heavy tabletop RPG, Pathfinder, D&D, not just D&D.
Yeah, the thing about, like, is your monster interesting or is your monster not interesting is that you have to consider the way that your players actually engage with your monster in the same way that, like, if you were going to say, oh, the lore of my setting is interesting, the lore of this city is interesting, the trade politics of this city with the neighboring city are very interesting. But they're only interesting in your game if you have a way to actually reveal it to your players and hook your players with it and get your players interested. So your monster is only as interesting as the amount of your monster that your players actually get to experience and interact with.
Absolutely. That is the key. Like, it's very easy to make a monster where you think it's interesting. You've written down like 30 things on the monster. I'll give an example of entire game systems that are guilty of this, which is anything on the 3.0, 3.5 Pathfinder 1 chassis is very heavily guilty of this, and Pathfinder 2 couldn't completely move itself away from this, but Logan and I really tried to do so on a lot of monsters, which is that they would just have like 30 spell-like abilities. And you know what? Some of those spell-like abilities would be really strong, and they'd be like, yes, this is my primo move. I want to use this Meteor Swarm. Like, that's a good spell. I'm going to use it. Some of them would be like, oh, yeah, this would allow me to, like, go around and, like, charm a cult of people to follow me in the story. I'd use this outside of combat all the time. And so those are the kind that when we went to Pathfinder 2, we wanted to always keep. But then there would be other ones that would be like, okay, sure. I guess I have Produce Flame, which, you know, back in the day was not a cantrip. And you used up one, it was like a slotted spell. It's like, okay, this does almost no damage. This is like a 13th level monster. Why does it even have this low level slotted spell? I don't understand. And so making sure that you don't put in tons of abilities you can't use. You only have a little bit of time before that monster dies, before it's killed by the player. And even if it somehow lasts for an extra number of rounds, I think that the players, like, their main impression of the creature really kicks in from the beginning of the fight. Like, what were those big iconic things they did? If a fight drags on for 10 rounds, they're not going to remember what it did on round 8 because it ran out of 7 good things to do. So I think from that regard, when you think about monsters, try to think about them from both the story perspective of like what they are, how they make sense, but also from the gameplay perspective of what are they going to do when they come on the scene? Like dragons, right? What are they going to do? They're probably going to fly down and breathe fire. Like, that's just likely something that you would expect the dragon to do to start off with. In Pathfinder 2, the dragons also have an ability to get their fire breath, and it's not always fire, but you know, to get their breath weapon back by getting a critical hit with one of their sort of unarmed attacks. So probably the next thing they want to do after that is go on a frenzy of unarmed attacks, either against someone who rushed them in melee, or maybe the easiest to hit looking target, so they're the most likely to get a critical hit and get back their breath weapon. So they've got sort of a story and a through line for what they want to do in combat. Now, the players are going to mess around with that. They're going to put defenses, they're going to put bottlenecks, they're going to put crowd control. They're not going to want to let the dragon do its core thing that it wants to do, and that's great. That's actually really good that there's counterplay. But you want to know what the dragon hypothetically, theoretically wants to do. And if it was loaded with 12 other abilities, then you don't know that. You'd have to figure it out.
Yeah, it was common in like 3rd edition D&D for system mastery to be kind of an important part of engaging with the rules of the game. So there's a lot of like trap options or feats that aren't good and that you need to navigate around while building your character. And this philosophy of having trap options kind of applied to the monsters as well while you're running them, where you have so much stuff in this stat block, but you need to research the stat block and identify which things are actually worth using. And it's, I mean, we've moved away from the trap feat design across the entire industry for a good reason. It wasn't great. It wasn't fun. Taking an option that was only put in there to fool you and make you think that it was good is not fun when you take it. And so having a creature like the dragons are a really good example. I like the Pathfinder 2 dragon design a lot because it guides you intuitively in how you should run this dragon. You should set up for the breath weapon first, and then you should use Draconic Frenzy to maximize the number of attacks you're making to crit fish to get the breath weapon back as quickly as possible. These two abilities can't be used in the same turn because the breath weapon needs to recharge, so they're not always competing with each other, but they serve purposes that are entwined with each other and play off of each other.
Right, and the fact that Draconic Frenzy lets you make a lot of attacks that eventually have a pretty bad bonus means that you are heavily encouraged as the dragon, if you can get to them, to go after that squishy person. Because when you're making a claw at a -8, if you want to have even a chance of getting a critical hit with that, then you better be higher level than your opponent, and they better be like a really squishy target. Because other than that, that claw is only going to get a crit on a natural 20. So it inherently guides a dragon playstyle. And that's what you want to see. Especially good because when you're talking about your own home game, you know what? If you want to give your creature 12 abilities in your home game, it takes you time. You probably understand how it works because you made it. So you don't have to worry about the thing that Jess and I were both talking about learning the complexity. If it's a published bestiary monster, then, well, it doesn't take you any time to have the 12 abilities there, but you have to figure out the monster, which adds to your prep time. And there's a space concern, because if it's published in a printed product, then chances are that the monster is going to be 1 or 2 pages exactly. And maybe you'll be in a worse shape, where you have something like when Jess had to write a bunch of elementals, and we had to fit, 4 on 2 pages? That was wild.
I believe I was actually assigned to write 5 in 2 pages, but then in development you realized that this was untenable.
Yeah, that could be true. That could be true. Even 4 is a 10 ability level that is below what I would like. 3 pushes it, and it would be great to have 1 page for 1 creature in many cases. But the bottom line is that when you create a creature where the abilities tell a story, they have a through line, there's an obvious big first splashy move to make that will make an impression on your players, that can help it take fewer words so that you have more space for lore, or that you can just fit it in the space allotted. So it's good for published monsters, it's good for homebrew monsters.
Yeah, when you're designing creatures as homebrew, you want to consider, because you have the opportunity to, the context that you're actually using them in. So that's not just the terrain that you're going to have them appear in, the size of the room that they'll be in, but that's relevant as well. But you also want to think, is this a creature that is going to appear by itself? Are 2 or 3 of this same creature going to appear in the same encounter? Or is this creature going to appear alongside another creature? And if you're designing all of these creatures yourself, you have the ability to create creatures that will play off of having multiple of the same creature. So, like if they have pack abilities, like wolves often do in TTRPGs, or if they will benefit from positioning a lot, if they have abilities to shove, if they get extra benefits from making creatures off guard, or if they need to do a lot of strategy about their positioning because they have like burst attacks or line attacks or something, and they need to be very conscious of where they are in relation to their allies.
Absolutely. And I see people mentioning this in chat as well, which is the action economy can go both ways. You can have that giant pack of wolves that outnumbers the PCs, but you can also have the one big monster that is outnumbered by the PCs. And what you want from those creatures varies depending on those use cases. And, you know, in a lot of RPGs, you can use a monster in multiple ways. So you might want a creature that has the option to have it both ways. But in terms of a creature that is going to gang up, you want it to have something fairly simple because you may have to run like 8 or 10 of them. That's kind of synergistic and that gives the feeling of being surrounded by the creatures so that there's this psychological feel of threat. But you want to make sure each individual creature is not so threatening that once they get hit by 10 of them, that inevitably 2 of the party members are down because, well, you know, each one was threatening enough to take out 20% of a party member, and that's what the math said. Whereas with the solo monster, it does need to have an ability to do something that is scary. It doesn't need to kill anyone. It doesn't even need to knock anyone out right away. But when it comes on the field and takes its first turn, you'd like it, ideally, to be scary. And by that, I mean deal big damage to somebody, deal good enough damage to a whole bunch of people that you're like, oh, whoa, we don't want to keep seeing that. Or do some like really kind of nasty debuffs that either make you be actually worried about what's going to happen next or be like, ooh, that has long-term consequences for this debuff. Something that feels.
Yeah, this is the role that the Dragon Breath has. It comes onto the field, it does Dragon Breath right away, and everybody understands, oh no, we need to take this thing out before it can breathe its breath again.
Absolutely. Dragon Breath is just a great ability for multiple reasons in this sort of framework, and that is one of them. But doing heavy damage, going into an area, or inflicting some kind of really nasty condition are all ways that the party can start sweating, feeling a little tension, even if the monster is not actually from behind the screen where you're looking at it. You think, okay, it's probably still not going to kill them, though. Like, they're going to be okay, looking at what it's got left and what they've got left. But the ability to do that and then have them win in the end is actually ideal for a monster that's going to be fighting alone. Okay, we had the perfect chat in chat that said, all right, I don't know what any of this has to do with Steven's brother's film career as a costume designer, so I'm going to head out. Yeah,
well, see, when he's designing the costumes, he has to make sure that if they appear as like a trio on the stage, right, they need to play off each other and have costumes that work good as a group and they're not overshadowing each other. But when it's like the main character and they come out, they have to have the dragon's breath of costumes where they're really making a splash on the stage.
Okay, that was a good effort. I'm going to see if I can do it. Okay, here's my one. So a good example of a big, dangerous-looking threat that did bring tension to everyone in the area, but then ultimately was defeated without really killing anyone that was at least main characters, is the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man from Ghostbusters. It's this gigantic marshmallow man. Everyone's like, oh my gosh, what did you do? Why did you think of something? I think it was Ray who thought of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man and couldn't avoid it. And so that became the doom of humanity. And so what you need to know, though, is that Steven's brother, Danny Glicker, did the costume design on the new Ghostbusters movie. And so they had to researched the old Ghostbuster movie. He got one of the like initial Ghostbusters like insignia things and gave it to Steven. And then he had like one of the ghost traps that just is the Ghostbusters traps with the thing that was like in his house. And he showed to Steven. And you can see from that in movies they also use that same technique that you should use in your tabletop role playing game, where there's the scary looking creature. It does something pretty scary at the beginning, but then it's defeatable to establish make it not feel like a pushover, make it not feel like it's weak, and make people not feel like they're unhappy because they're just steamrolling.
Yeah.
How did I do?
That was incredible. Also, when I went to Universal Studios Halloween Horror Night last year, they had a Stay Puft Marshmallow Man s'more where they actually had like a marshmallow man and then put him in between the graham crackers and the chocolate. And it was entirely too much marshmallow for a single s'more.
Okay, well, if Steven was here, he would point out that they were doing the D&D version of those Halloween nights.
Yes.
And that he wants to go see it and thinks that it could be like a big good thing for D&D because theme parks are making a lot of money.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, Mark T says that it's great to see me on the stream because I'm great. Thank you so much.
And thanks for the super chat.
Yeah.
All right, so we took a look at the beginning here, or at least the beginning after we did the little short thing, about making a monster that you know is not going to have a lot of screen time, so make sure it comes in and it has a big impact at the beginning and has a story and a through line that you know what it's planning on doing as you move along. So another way that you can make that your monster interesting is ironically by not making the monster the only focus of the scene that it's in. You might think, wait a minute, how am I going to make the monster interesting if it's not the only thing? But it's in the same way that when you're cooking, you might want to add spices or garnishes or other sides to the dish that bring out the flavor of the main dish. But if you have a monster and the only thing that's to do is fight it, then it could wind up getting into just I hit for damage, I get hit for damage. We use our techniques that we normally do, but then the monster's gone. If you have some hazards that are on the battlefield that are supporting the monster that have to be dealt with, or even like alternate objectives that have to be dealt with at the same time as the monster, like maybe the monster as it's fighting is like creating rock slides and you need to, there are NPCs in the area that you want to get them clear of the problem or shore up the area with crafting or something like that. It gives not only more of a story to the scene that gets the monster have a role that's in the story other than just the thing we beat up on, it also can engage your players' competitiveness with the idea of we want a flawless victory with all the NPCs saved. So they have to decide how many resources they spend to make sure they win the fight against the monster and how many they're willing to spend to save the NPCs. And so if they're steamrolling or if they're heading towards a steamroll, they'll pull back and put more resources to saving the NPCs, thus allowing the monster a few more crucial rounds to live, to do its cool stuff, and to show off what it can do.
In Pathfinder 2, a lot of the complex hazards take multiple like disabled checks to actually fully disable them. And some of them will have rules like in the creature's routine, it has 5 actions, but every time you make a successful disable check, it loses an action. So it has 5 actions at full strength, and then 4, and then 3, and then 2, and then 1, and then it's fully disabled once you've made enough disable checks. But another option that you have, if you don't want the hazard to just get progressively weaker, if you want the players to be spending an action every round on protecting the civilians, is you could have a hazard that doesn't lose strength, but if they don't make a successful check to disable it that round, then it does its routine. And so it stays present the whole combat as a threat, and they need to be actively putting in effort to push off the consequences of it, and any round where they don't successfully disable it, it does its destruction.
Another way that you can turn that into that very same technique of storytelling in a fight that Jess just gave into a carrot instead of a stick potentially is if you have an enemy that either you add buffs to it or it just naturally is too hard and you shouldn't be able to fight it normally. And then there's things you can do on the battlefield that like strip off the extra buffs or debuff it if it was naturally strong. Like special weaponry that's set up that can do extra damage or debuff the enemy, or like let's say that you're fighting a creature that like escaped from a ritualistic summoning and it overpowered its summoner, but you know the circle is still there and there's 5 points to the circle. The PCs can go to each of the 5 points to channel like the elements of earth, fire, air, water, and ether, or whatever you're doing in your setting there, right? And reestablish the circle, and each one they do might put a unique debuff onto the creature or remove a buff that you gave to the creature, just depending on which direction you do that. And so that way they feel like they're contributing even directly to the fight by getting rid of some of the creature's extra stuff. And you can mix both of those in by having the creature seemingly has multiple parts. So like the thing that is the hazard that Jess mentioned before, maybe that's like the creature's wings have countless eyes on them that shoot out laser beams. But if you do this other thing, then you can blind the eyes for a round and they can't shoot the laser beams. So there's a numerous ways that you can cause this to be part of the creature, cause it to be part of the scene, cause it to be part of the story behind this situation.
Yeah. And you also want to be careful when you're doing something that will debuff the enemy. You want to make sure that you're not writing in a debuff that won't stack with the debuffs that the players might already want to be doing. Like, you could have a debuff that makes the enemy off guard for the rest of the combat, but if the players were already flanking with each other and getting the enemy off guard, then you're not actually giving them a buff in addition to what they were already doing. You're just creating a situation where they no longer need to flank with each other. And so the question is there actually a benefit to them of not needing to flank in this combat? Is the terrain arranged such that they get some kind of benefit if they're standing next to each other? Or do you want the debuff to instead be applying the weak template instead of making them off guard?
That's right. And that's one reason why having special buffs for the enemy that get stripped away is more guaranteed to sort of be cumulative with whatever the players are doing, because they probably didn't have a way to remove some buff you added to the creature. Like, let's say it's a red dragon. You know what? Red dragons or cinder dragons or whatever you want to call them are a very iconic creature. And we've talked about dragons as an example before. But maybe this dragon has like set up special crystals around, in their lair to give them actually resistance to cold, because they know it's their weakness. And so if you destroy the resonant crystal, it removes their resistance to cold. Now you can trigger their cold weakness just like that. Now, you could also do it in another way that seems less like the monster was covering for its previous weakness by doing something special that just creates a weakness. And it's like, yeah, this creature normally doesn't have a weakness. Now it is weak 10 to, it's weak 10 at this point to piercing because you cracked its hard carapace and you can hit the soft parts underneath.
Yeah. In Pathfinder 2, a lot of the like animated objects have a construct armor ability where their AC goes down after you reach a certain HP threshold. But if you're homebrewing your own monster, you can apply that onto anything. You can put that onto a creature that has a hard carapace, and once the carapace is cracked, its armor class goes down. And so the first half of the fight is very scary and very challenging, but once the players reach a certain threshold, it becomes more cleanup. They can quickly crit it into oblivion and defeat it once they reach that threshold. So it does have this amount of HP, but the entire fight is not equally dangerous spread out across the entire encounter.
Yeah, during the late stages of the Pathfinder 2 playtest, my group, who were veterans of Pathfinder 1 and played it for a very long time, I was running for them, and that animated object ability was some of the players' like favorite new thing. For look, everyone, cat alert! But it was one of their. They were just like, this is great. This is the best thing I've seen so far in Pathfinder 2, because they just loved the state change that it went from being this, it's hard to hit, it has hardness, and all of our attacks aren't working, to, bam, its armor is off. Now let's beat it down. And that just
Yeah.
made the story of the monster really sing for... One of the players was sold completely on PF2 by that animated creature ability. We can generalize that into a broader sense, which is you could create creatures that'll be more interesting if they have multiple phases or the ability to shift between different modes. It could be an offense versus defense mode. In the case of the animated object, it's a strong defense versus weaker defense once you've cracked through it. And like their strong defense is a little too strong for a creature of their level if it kept it the whole fight, whereas their weak defense is like, this is very weak and they will die quickly. And so the average of those two comes down to this is about right. But it could lead to tension if you can't get through the strong phase fast enough, or an easy fight if you get lucky and break the armor quickly. But there's a lot more options you can have for that, right? You could have like a creature that is like a protector guardian spirit that's like normally in a defensive mode, but if you like defile the area they're protecting or hurt them too much, it angers them, and then they like their appearance shifts. Maybe let's say they're a protector of like a natural spring, and like the water bubbles up and boils, and then they get a different set of attacks that are more offense based and lose defenses.
Or if you're homebrewing creatures anyway, you can write two creatures that are intended to be encountered together. And one of them is like the protector guardian creature, but once the other creature is defeated, they go into their phase 2 and become, I don't know, enraged and more dangerous and do more damage because you killed the thing that it was protecting.
I don't know if it was one of the monsters that you judged or not, but there was a Battlezoo Bestiary monster that wound up in Elemental Storm, I believe, wound up being two monsters that basically there was like a gold and a silver version of it. It had mostly the same base stat block. They were always encountered in pairs, but they had separate abilities for the gold one and the silver one. And like one of the two of them like could cause bleeding, and then the other one, if they had benefits against a bleeding creature, and like the one that had benefits against a bleeding creature could like trip, and the other one that caused bleeding was good against prone creatures. And so it was a very tag team situation where they had a lot of teamwork, but that also allowed counterplay where the players could try to break up that teamwork and remove the synergies.
Yeah, definitely. When you're just running your own game and you're customizing monsters or creating your own monsters and you have full control and understanding over the context that you're going to deploy them in, you have the opportunity to do a lot of really interesting things in terms of the synergy between the different monsters that you're using or the monsters in the map that you're going to put them on.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the map that you're going to put the creatures on. So if you have elements of the terrain that the creature can use, that can always be fun. Like, even if it's not this big dragon, like we're using examples, if it's tiny creatures, maybe there's little tunnels that only tiny creatures can go through that allow them to traverse the area more efficiently, while the PCs have to take these twisty, windy paths that are inefficient. But you can also have dynamic terrain that the monsters or the players and their characters can take advantage of the things that are in the dynamic terrain, like rocks that could be pushed down to make them fall on other people, or areas that could be collapsed if they're hit and open up a new passageway, or like shifting platforms that move at the end of each round to where they up and down like elevators or across the battlefield.
Yeah. So like the example earlier about, maybe you don't want to debuff the enemy by just making it off guard for the entire combat, because what if the players are already making each other off guard? But on the other hand, that might be really good if you know that the map that you're going to deploy this on is like a river where everyone is standing on a different log and the combat is mostly a ranged combat. And so in ranged combat, it's exceptionally difficult for a rogue to get sneak attack. But if you can debuff the enemy and make it off guard even to ranged attacks, now that's a really desirable debuff, because it would be difficult to be jumping onto the same log or the same raft as the creature if the creature like occupies the entire raft.
That's right. That idea with like the rafts that are moving down the river kind of reminds me of some of those Super Smash Brothers F-Zero levels where you're on the
Mhm.
cars and you're constantly jumping from car to car and everything in the level is moving. Like, that can be a fun way to do a very mobile battle that is not the same as a chase scene, because it's just
Yeah.
regular combat using encounter rounds that Jess was describing here. But you're just kind of on moving objects. There's actually something like that, I think, with like maybe a minecart chase or something like that in one of the Battlezoo adventures that you can wind up doing, and that can lead to an interesting story that allows the creature to shine. Obviously, if you don't want, just like with the dish, going back to the analogy, you don't want to like have the spices or the side dish like overpower the main course, and so you probably don't want the battlefield to completely overshadow the creatures that are in it unless the battlefield is the main course. Like maybe you're actually fighting on a moving kaiju, and the moving kaiju is actually the thing you want people to remember, and the monsters are kind of more incidental
Mhm.
to the threat. So I guess an important thing is to figure out what is your main course. It's probably the monsters, but maybe it isn't.
Yeah, it could be a hazard. And you could have the combat entirely structured around you need to disable this hazard, but the hazard is like, I don't know, printing constructs.
Yeah.
And so the machine needs to be disabled by you, but you also can't only disable the machine because it's printing these constructs that are going to attack you, and you have to balance your decision making against how much of our resources are we going to spend on defeating the constructs, knowing that more of them are just going to be printed, but knowing that if we don't deal with them, more of them will be printed and will just be overrun.
Yeah. Or like maybe the main course of the encounter is related to just like the overall scene and some kind of social thing that you're doing during the fight. Like imagine a situation that you're all on the back of a rampaging kaiju, because why not? I came up with that before. And it's kind of like in Final Fantasy X when you're on Sin and all the little monsters are popping up, but you don't care about them. They're just like little fins or pieces of Sin. You're gonna beat them. Those are the monsters. You're on this kaiju. It's out of control. And what do you know? But this NPC, he has gone into an anxiety spiral, but has the ability to stop the kaiju theoretically if he works really hard at it. But he just can't concentrate. The monsters are there. The kaiju's rampaging. So you have to beat back the monsters to make the diplomacy checks easier. But your diplomats are just trying to be like, calm down. It's gonna be okay. Just do the warding song so that the kaiju goes back to sleep. And like that could be the encounter. And so like sort of the battlefield in that case, the kaiju and the performer who is having his anxiety spiral are kind of the main course, and the monsters are just kind of like a way to create time pressure and like sort of add another element for fighting. So one other thing about monsters that can make them interesting is the information flow between you and the players
Oh, yeah.
about the monster.
Mm-hmm.
Like some of
Yeah.
like the most classic monsters in film are mysterious things that you might not even see on the screen for a long time. You just kind of see the side effects from them, and you're kind of left to imagine it. Tabletop RPG players do have a known reputation for sometimes having more trouble because you're not seeing it on the screen. You have to hear it from the GM, keeping track of a lot of details. So you do want to be a little careful about that. But if you can have a creature that you're painting an evocative picture of maybe like a small number of things about their abilities, about their features, rather than just be like, name drop some kind of obscure fantasy name that either they have heard of and now they immediately just know that it's that monster because they've read the bestiary, or they've never heard of what is a Chaidezu. I don't know what that is unless you do. But if you describe a very like evocative picture of what the monster is and then have it use an evocative ability, that sort of starts creating an inkling in the player's mind of trying to sort of catalog this mysterious being.
Yeah. And if you are creating your own monsters and you want the monster to have like a storytelling role in the game that you are running, you can make sure that you're creating abilities for it that do that storytelling and that support providing the players with an understanding of what the creature is. Like the Gliminal is a creature that I wrote for Pathfinder 2 that heals you to death. It heals you so much that you become suffused with positive energy and you explode. You have too much vitality. And so the the dynamic of a fight against a Gliminal where you start not even knowing what you're fighting and then this thing strikes you and it just kind of like heals you and you're like, oh, okay, this thing is like our friend, it's healing us, and then it keeps healing you and it keeps healing you, and at some point like you start making recall knowledge checks on it, like what is this thing, what's it doing, and you find out that if it keeps healing you you're going to explode, and then like the ramp of how you feel about this creature and the storytelling that its abilities are doing and the fact that it keeps healing you because it's a positive energy creature, and the ramp of tension in this fight is very different if the players start knowing what it is versus if they discover what it is through recall knowledge mid-combat.
I think also, and I may be misremembering the Pathfinder 1 version, but based on my memory of the Pathfinder 1 version and my strong memory of the Pathfinder 2 version, because I was one of the people who developed that one when Jess sent it in, I believe that an improvement in the Pathfinder 2 version is the fact that it sickens you once you start getting the overhealing and you feel that it's bad. Because the difference in a creature that, in Jess's brief description, that just heals you and then eventually you explode, and up until that point, if you didn't have either meta knowledge or your character knowing in-game knowledge that this was bad, you'd be like, okay, this is fine, I'll just sit here and let this happen. Is kind of like a gotcha moment, whereas the very good design choice that Jess did on the PF2 Gliminal is that you feel sick and like you're bloating up with the healing right away. So you know, wait a minute, something's off about this. This might not be a good thing that it's giving me all this healing.
Yeah.
So another thing about monsters and creatures in general is we talked about tying them into their environment, possibly using hazards and things like that. What part that will keep the creature interesting, memorable, and make sure that the players remember it after it's been defeated is if it leaves a memorable memento. And this can be either a good memento or a bad memento. A bad memento is something like, now I've got the curse of the were creature because we fought this werewolf, right? That's
or like the Linorms.
Yes, a Linorm death curse. Now I'm just have this horrible death curse until I can get rid of it. Like, nobody's gonna forget getting that death curse unless it happens to be that they were so good at removing curses they removed it immediately. But if they lived with it for a while, it suddenly makes that creature more memorable. But you know what? Use that sparingly. Usually it's good to have good mementos. That can either be because you gave the creature a weird ability that, like, defeating it gives you some kind of a buff for a while, or more likely because it had some kind of loot that was appropriate for the creature, or if you're using Battlezoo Bestiary, you can take monster parts from the creature, and then it's like, yeah, we defeated that red dragon, and I have now, like, put that red dragon's parts into my sword, and it's on fire now. And it does these weird special fire abilities, and it's a sword that was originally created from a Tyrannosaurus Rex's fang, and it was imbued with red dragon scales and is fiery. And so, like, because the aesthetics and the imagery of your weapon, it came from that creature, you're going to remember that creature because you're constantly using the weapon.
Yeah, some creatures are very iconic for this as well. Like, we keep talking about dragons all throughout the stream, but it's true that having a dragon scale armor is iconic. Having a dragon tooth weapon is iconic. Even if you're not using the Battlezoo monster parts, your players probably, after defeating a dragon, are going to have thoughts like, oh, can we make armor from the dragon scales? And you have the ability to create items for them, to work with them in whatever quest they do to, you know, they have the dragon scales, but if they don't have a really high rank in craft themselves. Now they have to find someone who can work with dragon scale, and who even is that?
Right. It's got quest potential, and yeah, you can easily homebrew your own item. You don't have to use the Battlezoo monster part system. That is just simply a system that allows you to
Yep.
plug in any monster in the entire game, even one that, like, it's not written for specific monsters like dragons or owlbears. It's just like any fire monster can do this fire thing. It just sort of asks you some yes or no questions about your monster, and anytime you say yes, that unlocks another thing that your players can do with the item. But if you have a specific monster, you want it to be very specific, like I want an owlbear cloak, and it's only made from owlbears. Yeah, you should homebrew your own item for that. That's great if you have the time and the skill to do that. If you don't, you might be able to reflavor something, but if it's a common item that you're reflavoring, it might not have as much impact. It still can be fun if it's like, yeah, it's like this basic cloak, but it's made from owlbears and it looks like an owlbear. That can be enough for some people. Honestly, up until like in 3rd edition D&D and Pathfinder 1, owlbear and dire tiger were, and I've said this before on certain streams, were almost the exact same stat block, except for the dire tiger had like pounce and one more thing. They had the tiger had all the same abilities as the owlbear, and almost all of its numbers were either identical or very close. And I discovered this by accident. I've been playing for years without knowing that, and it was when I was creating Pathfinder 2 version of some of these that I was like, wait a minute, this is almost exactly the same monster. And just the aesthetics, just the reflavoring, just the reskinning made me feel like an owlbear was different than a dire tiger at the time. And similarly, your items could feel very different if you just tell your players it was made from an owlbear. That takes a lot less work from you.
Yeah, and this is also true about creating your own monsters. If you are creating a custom monster, you don't actually have to write a bunch of your own abilities. You can just scavenge abilities off of existing monsters and combine them in a novel way that doesn't exist on other monsters.
That's true. You can either do that and just now you've got a completely new monster, or there could be a plot point where this is like a chimera of some of those other original monsters that's being created by like an alchemist or some kind of opponent that is like, why is this opponent capturing these monsters and combining them to create these deadly monsters with these other combinations? How are they getting those monsters? Where's their laboratory? Like, that could be a plot point, or it's just like, no, I just came up with a new creature. It's always been in this world, and it happens to combine this ability from that monster and with that ability from this other monster. Like, nothing says the abilities you create have to be super unique and complicated. When we're saying give them evocative abilities that your players are going to be able to remember, and we use Breath Weapon as an example, that's a very simple ability. It's basically just damage in an area.
And the dragons all have different breath weapons, but a lot of other creatures have abilities that functionally are the same thing as the breath weapon. There's a thunderbird that has an electric one that has the recharging. The parry has something that needs to recharge. A lot of creatures use this same mechanic, and there's nothing wrong with if you're creating another creature and you want to create the same pressure of the monster comes in, does something very big and explosive and scary, and now the players are on a clock to defeat it before it does that again. You take the same mechanic because it's the one that works. It's the rules for this kind of thing.
Don't reinvent the wheel. Now, if you do reinvent the wheel, it's not going to make your monster uninteresting. You're just going to be doing more work than you need to, and you're giving up the advantage of having used rules tech that you knew was successful at making your monster interesting. So your monster is actually more likely to be interesting if you lift from mechanics that you know that work rather than reinventing the wheel. That being said, you know what? Occasionally having some really innovative mechanic that has never been seen before is fun, and it shakes things up. So I'm not saying never do it, but if what you want is fundamentally basically something that's already been figured out in a way that works for you and your group, like maybe your group hates breath weapons and it never works for you, but if you're most groups, then that does raise the tension, and then you can just use that style of mechanic. And in fact, many creatures, like Jess said, other than dragons, use the same kind of recharge mechanic for their big flashy special ability, just because that's a fun tension to have in the game.
And yeah, like chat said, when you're creating your own creatures, you can just tell your group, I'm playtesting a new creature I wrote. I don't know how this is gonna go. Like that's allowed.
Also, if your creature is very experimental and you realize partway through that one of the abilities you created was way overtuned, there's nothing wrong with deciding retroactively that one of the other things that was not, in my case, I would say not one that's already been displayed during the fight. Like, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, remember when you guys missed on a 23? Well, now you hit on a 23 and a 22 and a 21. Unless it's something like that armor. But, like, maybe you do that. Maybe you suddenly give the creature an ability where its armor shatters that you hadn't planned on giving it before. And are like, oh, you hit it for just enough. And just enough happened to be the amount they just hit it for. And you realize that you completely overtuned something. And now its armor breaks and its armor class is down by 4. Like, that could just be something you come up with on the fly to make up for the fact that you messed up. Because some GMs will just change the creature no matter what if the players are losing. I'm not in favor of that personally, but I also am totally okay with GMs who do that if that's what their players are in for and the players have agreed. But even then, if it's my fault, if it's not because of the dice being wild or the players' tactics or anything like that, but it's my fault because I created an ability that was drastically overtuned, then it is my responsibility to add a new countermeasure ability or have its hit points be lower than I originally planned, because maybe that's a balance factor for the ability being too strong, is that it's a glass cannon. It has lower hit points. So I think I've given out here in this hour a lot of my main tips for making sure your monster is awesome with the limited play time and screen time and player attention that that it's going to be able to receive. Jess, do you have any other big topics that you want to cover for monsters?
We covered this a little bit already when I was talking about how the dragon's abilities informed the GM of what order to use them in and when to use one rather than the other. But you just want to stay conscious of every ability that you give a creature is competing with the other abilities that creature has. And so if the creature has like a 3-action ability, that's the only thing it can do on that turn. And 3-action abilities can also be difficult to pull off, because if the 3-action ability is like you make 3 melee strikes or something, then you have to already be in position before you can use it. And an ability like that, where it takes up an entire turn, it's a full round action, but you need to already be in position and no one can have moved out of position in the time between your last turn and this turn, an ability like that is unlikely to actually get used. And if the creature can never use that, but that's its thing that it did, and all it has other than that is like making strikes and striding, then it's not likely to be very memorable. But in the same way, if the creature has like 3 abilities it can use that are all 2 actions, and so it can get into position and then use this ability, they're competing with each other. You can only use one of them in each round, and you have to decide which of them you're going to use. And so why is it that you have 3 abilities that compete with each other unless they have some kind of interplay to inform how they're used and when they're used and under what circumstances?
That makes sense.
Designing for like really niche circumstances is kind of dangerous, because you're really at risk of an ability never actually coming up unless you are designing the rest of the encounter around engineering those circumstances.
So when Jess is talking about the 2 and 3 action abilities, those would be like the abilities in D&D that take your action. Because the creature only has one of those in D&D, and in Pathfinder 2, they only have one per time per turn at most that they can do something that takes 2 or 3 of their 3 actions. And so if the number of turns the fight is expecting to last is lower than the number of abilities you have that take your main turn, there's no way you're going to be able to use all of them. And so it just comes down to a niche. Like 3, maybe, especially if they all can only be used once per fight. It's like, I'll use number 1, number 2, and then number 3. But if you have 5 or 6, it's like, no. The only reason to even have that many of them is exactly a countermeasure. A countermeasure for like, oh, this is the one that they only use if the PCs are being like cheese weasel kiters and flying away from it because it doesn't have any ranged attacks. So it does this gravity pull ability that pulls everybody onto the ground. It's like, sure, okay. I know I'm not going to do that if everybody's already on the ground. So it doesn't waste a lot of mental bandwidth to do so. It does take page space if I'm publishing this, though.
Kind of the same pit that spellcasting enemies fall into, where if a spellcasting enemy has so many spell options and now you have to check out all of these spells and then make decisions about which of these spells is the one to cast in this circumstance, that's a lot of decision making on the GM, and also a lot of spells that are just kind of hanging out on the page to hang out on the page and not actually get cast. Like, it was very common in older editions of D&D to, and maybe in the current edition, I'm not sure, to have a full spell list, spells of every level for any spell casting enemy. So you have your cantrips, you have your first level spells, you have your second level spells, you have your third level spells. Even though this enemy is going to survive for like 4 rounds, they're not going to get whittled down to casting third level spells. It's not going to happen. You're not going to use those. They're just there.
Yeah. I definitely wish that you did not have to include those, but it is true that spellcasting creatures like the Archmage and the SRD for 5e, or the Lich in Pathfinder 2 still have those.
Yes.
Because there are some people at Paizo, I know Linda is big on the get rid of those, come on, front. But the problem is that a lot of playtesters didn't like it. For the very spellcastery ones like the Lich or like the Archmage in D&D 5e, where it's like, this is an Archmage! I want to be an Archmage one day, and I'm not going to lose my first and second rank spells, so why are they going to lose these? And enough of the playtesters in the community did not want to lose them, even though they absolutely are clutter in terms of what you actually need most of the time. And they can be annoying in designing the creature because you run into a few things. Whereas you have some freelancers or designers who spend needlessly long trying to find what few first and second rank spells exist that are going to actually be useful in some small subset of situations for this 17th level monster to cast. And then also, the spell lists wind up looking weirdly similar to each other on every creature because they find the same few spells. Or, more often, you find a situation where the freelancer picked spells that are incredibly thematic for that creature and are like, yes, this screams Lich, but are actually completely useless in 100% of all situations because they're even worse than their cantrips are in the low-level slots. And then the developer has to either keep them for thematics and be like, well, this is a trap, but whatever, it's thematic, or be like, no, I'm switching them out for the same few spells that that actually work at those. So it's just, it's not great, but current games do it because enough players would get weirded out by the creatures not having it if they're meant to be like a wizard just like me.
Yeah, I think a sidebar would have been a better approach, or like a universal monster ability that is like full caster, and then the explanation is this creature has access to all of the spells that a player character spellcaster of their level would have, and if you wish to prepare their first and second level spells, feel free. They do have those spell slots, they're just not included in the creature's stat block if the creature is like a band of 4 levels of spells is included in any spell block, but this creature has access to all of the other ones that it would have if it were a player character of that level. But regardless of that, if you are homebrewing a monster, you don't have to worry about this.
Right.
You don't have to pick all of these spells.
Also, I want to be clear that like the Archmage creature in 5e and the Lich in Pathfinder 2 are very much exceptions that prove the rule that generally these monsters do not have these pointless extra spells. D&D 2024 even cut it down even more. Whereas the Pathfinder remaster, I think just there already weren't that many creatures that had a ton of spells like that to begin with. And so usually you don't have to worry with that to begin with in very modern editions. But if you go back even just a few editions of D&D or Pathfinder, you'll see it all over the place.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, one thing that you can do with spellcasting creatures is like, it's fine if all of this creature's spells at a given level are the same spell. It's okay for this creature to cast the same spell multiple times instead of racking your brain and learning the mechanics of 3 different spells for this creature and then agonizing over which one of these 3 is ideal in this given. Like it's okay for it to just have multiple preparations of the same spell.
If you were using Vancian prepared spellcasters. I think the equivalent piece of advice for a spontaneous caster or like a 5e style flexible prep is to just give them a bunch of slots at that level, but not very many actual spells prepared.
Yeah. If the thing that you actually imagine this creature doing is casting lightning bolt, it's okay if it just casts lightning bolt.
Yeah. You can just have a lightning mage that either, if they're, again, Vancian prepared, has lightning bolt parentheses 3, or for one of the other styles is just like 3rd rank spells, 4 per day, lightning bolt. Is there anything else on there? No, only lightning bolt.
Yeah. Because the real problem with the big spell list is that realistically this thing is going to get like 3 or 4 turns. It's going to cast 3 or 4 spells. It doesn't need to have 20 of them.
Usually what I would put in there would be like lightning bolt and then like a couple of countermeasure spells, such if they're getting hard countered by something, that I can pull that out to. But I don't want to, because I want to cast lightning bolt every turn. So it's lightning bolt, and then the things I cast what I sadly cannot cast lightning bolt because the players have outsmarted me.
You can have a couple that function differently but serve the same role. Like you can have a spell that is a line effect and a spell that is a cone. You can have like a line and a cone, and then make your decisions about which one positionally makes the most sense for the spellcaster to do on this turn without, it only has so many turns. It just comes back to, you need this creature to do its thing within the number of turns that it has. And so its thing should be a thing that it does while it's on screen before it dies. And then it doesn't, if it had a bunch of abilities that it never got to use because it doesn't survive that long, they were pointless and they'd never really existed in the game.
With the caveat of explicitly off-screen abilities that would be useful for it to use to advance the story, like I suggested before, it could charm a cult of followers with this ability outside of the combat. Those are okay. You don't have to get rid of those. You can keep those because they're not meant to be used during the fight. Maybe they're not strong enough to charm the PCs. And like in a lot of those stories with like the creature who has charmed like the weaker-willed low-level NPCs, that it might try to use it on the main heroes in like, a movie or a book, but it doesn't work on them because they're strong-willed, and that's all right to have. Just know that's what absolutely. You created.
Yeah, no, if you're creating a creature that the thing that it's doing is outside of combat, then yes, it should have abilities that it's doing outside of combat. If the creature charms enemies and it's doing that as like your story point that you're doing, then of course it should have the ability to charm those creatures. And it doesn't necessarily need to have the ability to charm creatures in combat just because that's what it does out of combat. But it's just being realistic about the context that you're deploying this creature in. And if the context is a combat, than being realistic of how much of this creature you can actually even use.
Absolutely. And make sure that the abilities you create do the thing that you want them to do. Here's a good example. I'm talking about charming someone for a long time. So we created a Pathfinder 2 ritual called Inveigle that was basically like Jafar in Aladdin with the Sultan, where he just has him under his thumb. And the reason why we did that is that I had run a lot of Pathfinder 1 adventure paths where they basically were like, they wanted charm to do this, but it didn't, and it only lasted for the charm that the creature had only lasted for like a short amount of time. So then they would just add in the plot points that would be like, this random like Dompier who bare-chested Dompier guy who's down here has been charmed so many times by the leader of this dungeon that eventually he just became special charmed, and even when it wore off, he's sort of charmed, and you have to like snap him out of it. But there was not actually a game mechanic for that. It was just sort of like, it makes sense in the story. It's not a problem that they did that, but they couldn't. The game rules didn't actually do the thing they wanted, so they had to like write it in. And this was not once; it was like 4 or 5 times. So that made me realize there was a hole in the game mechanics for something that would let you just do that. And this person is just been completely inveigled by this other person for the story. So make sure that the creature has an ability that actually lets it do the story thing that you want, rather than a related combat-ish ability that it's not going to use during combat and that vaguely is in the direction that you want for the story, but doesn't actually let it do the thing you want in the story either.
Yeah, and if you're homebrewing all of this stuff for yourself in Pathfinder 2, the design space of rituals is a great place to do this for, because you're predominantly not, I don't even think you can cast rituals in combat. And so
you could, but you would have to basically have the combat go on for like thousands of rounds.
Yeah.
So it's very infeasible.
Yeah. And so the ritual design space, anything that you put in the ritual section of the stat block is a safe place to put things where you don't have to look at this line for spells to cast in combat. It's okay to ignore it during the combat and then just come back to it when you are plotting out what this thing does outside of combat with its time.
That's right. And obviously 5e has rituals as well, but they have to be for a spell that can also be cast not as a ritual, and then it just increases the time to cast it so it doesn't spend up a spell slot. And so in that sense, you could come up with the ability for a 5e creature, to have a spell but like be like ritual only, and be like, does it have any spell slots of this level that it can use to cast the spell? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it can only do this as a ritual outside of combat, and that way you don't have to worry about thinking about using that during the fight, because it doesn't have 10 minutes to do that. So did we cover everything? Because you're right, when we were talking before, that was a nuance of the first topic that we came up with that we did not fully get into before we moved on to the second topic.
Yeah. I think we could talk about creature families, I guess.
So that's a good point. Creature families can be a good way to make a creature immediately more compelling, but it can be a risk if you put too many things into a creature family. So make sure it feels earned, and like that creature really belongs in the family, and not that you kind of just shoehorned it in to try to like catch the cachet of a really famous family with your new creature. Your players are going to be able to tell.
Yeah, creature families are a good way to have lore for a creature and like familiarity and buy-in from the players, and also to crib certain mechanics and like weaknesses and stuff, to have kind of a pattern for yourself while you're creating a monster. That also lets the players, if they're encountering higher and higher level creatures of the same family, they have a foundation of tactics and knowledge of this creature that they are entering into each encounter with. So each encounter isn't starting from a baseline 0 knowledge. They're entering the encounter knowing that the Fae are weak to cold iron. every time they're fighting one. And so you need to consider when you're doing when you're planning like a bunch of Fey encounters and they're building on this same knowledge, or you're doing a bunch of demon encounters and you're building on this knowledge, there's a certain baseline that you can expect the players to already be familiar with a certain mechanic because they've encountered it before. And this lets you be more experimental with it as you build on their knowledge.
Absolutely. And it gives a baseline, and it also sort of inherently gives something compelling if the players already have a buy-in about that family of creatures. They'd be like, oh, it's another demon. Well, my ranger hates demons, and I already hate this creature because it's a demon. Or it's like, oh yeah, this is a Fae. We have to watch our wording. They might offer us tricks and opportunities that seem too good to be true, but there's a catch. And so because it brings in these other story elements, including a creature that's a member of a family is very similar to including a creature from real-world folklore. And sometimes it'll be both, because a Fae is often from both, but maybe it's only one. In that it has these sort of built-in expectations of the players that can be satisfied or subverted, and that can wind up enhancing the experience. It's another one of those types of spices you can add to a creature.
Definitely, yeah.
So I see a question in chat about whether healing is something that can be interesting or useful for your creatures. And I would say this. For one, you need to think about how much healing actually heals in the game you're playing. In 5e, healing usually is not very good because it doesn't heal for very much. In Pathfinder 2, healing heals for quite a lot and is actually quite powerful in general. But depending on what role the monster is going to play in your game, it might still not be a good idea. That's because of the fact that healing can usually roll back like enough damage that you could more or less negate like maybe even a couple of good hits or one like more powerful big move that somebody did if it wasn't like a major critical or something like that with your healing spell. But if that's like a solo enemy, then that could be like, I don't know, like you have a sinking ship and you've taken like a cup to try to bail out the water. Because even in PF2 where you can get rid of one PC's good turn with your healing, well, there's 3 other characters who are attacking you. And in 5e, it's less like using a cup when your ship is sinking and maybe more like using a spoon. Because it probably couldn't have even gotten rid of one character's worth of damage when you're casting the heal. So think about what is being included in the fight. Like if you have a weaker healer monster that is healing the main enemy, that's actually pretty rad if you're playing in PF2 or a game where healing is good. I've used that before, and I would say it was very effective because the amount of healing I was about to do was very high, except for that the players counterspelled my heals from the weaker healing monsters because they intentionally had counterspell and heal on both of both the wizard managed to get heal so that he could counterspell heal, and the cleric got counterspell so that he could counterspell heal. And so when these 2 angels came down to cast each cast a powerful healing spell on the boss, it was like a mid-fight trigger in the adventure path. They countered both of the heals and then killed the boss on the next turn. It was hilarious. It would have been good.
Yeah. As the game master, deploying the creature, and especially if you're homebrewing creatures as the person who's responsible for deciding how much HP this creature has to begin with, the point of putting healing onto your monster instead of just that amount of extra HP is kind of just a decision that at a certain point of the combat you want to take the creature's turn away and have the creature cast heal instead of using its other abilities. And so is your fight actually more interesting by having this creature's 3rd turn be spent on healing versus having it start with more HP anyway?
Yeah, it's tricky, right? You can give them more healing if they have to spend a turn on it rather than get it for free with regeneration or fast healing. But it can sometimes just be more interesting to have the enemy going on the offense because of the fact that that allows you to put pressure on the players, even if it's not really going to kill them. It makes them feel like more things are happening. Whereas the turn of healing is more of a release of pressure, as well as possibly an annoyance to the players of like watching their work get erased or reversed.
Yeah. It is possible to do healing abilities if you're employing them in novel ways versus just like giving the monster the ability to cast heal. Like it could have a reaction that it uses to steal healing from the players. It could have like a vampiric touch thing where it deals damage to the players and then recovers some of that for itself. It could have an ability where every time it crits, it gains temporary hit points. Or there could be minion monsters that can heal as reactions, or you can write abilities that interact between the two creatures so that every time the boss uses their breath weapon, the minions, if they're in the breath weapon, can heal from fire.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of ways to go about it, and some people in chat have pointed out, which is true, that D&D 2024's healing is way stronger than 2014. That's fair. It's not really a spoon anymore. It's more of like, I guess, like a teacup versus a cup. Like it's not quite to the strength of healing in Pathfinder 2. And don't get me wrong, some people could say that healing is too strong in Pathfinder 2. Like, I made it as strong as it is, and you could say, Mark, you made healing too strong in Pathfinder 2, and I would say you have a case to be made on that. And it's possible that depending on your game style that you'd rather have one that's weaker, like 2024, because you don't want to see healing outpacing damaging by too much. I'm just a fan of healing playstyles, and there have been too many tabletop RPGs where everyone's just like, the meta is all damage, no healing, no defense, rocket tag, kill everything on the first turn. And so I was hoping to lead us toward a meta where healing and defense were actually really useful. And some could say I swung it too far in that direction. I don't know. I would let you debate that. I wouldn't say you were wrong.
There's a question, how do you feel about regeneration that gets stopped by certain abilities versus health and Pathfinder 2 style weaknesses to set damage types? I like it.
Yeah,
I think weaknesses are great.
Yeah, and regeneration that you have to turn off is a great story beat. Because it's like, oh gosh, we can't stop this creature. It just keeps coming up. And then once you figure out, oh, if we kill it with ice, now it stays down. It suddenly changes from, like in the zombie movie where they're just, you can't stop them. And they're just relentless into the, like, we found the thing. Now we're fighting back. So it creates this momentum shift that you want to do with monsters where it's like, it seems grim. It seems stressful. It seems tense. The monster seems unbeatable for some reason, but the GM knows, oh, it really is. The players are going to be okay. And that regeneration that you can't overcome, but then you can, then gives you the shift that you want of like, oh my gosh, to we got this. It especially can be fun if they're also weak to that type of damage and have a ton of hit points despite having the regeneration. It can turn knowing about the damage and figuring out about the damage into a real moment of this creature just seems like, what is going on? It cannot be killed, into like, we got this. We can kill multiple of these.
Yeah. Yeah, I prefer giving a creature more HP and a weakness versus less HP and resistances.
Me too. I tried to push us more towards having that, but I like having both because you can feel different between, it feels very different to be fighting a Pathfinder 2 zombie and a Pathfinder 2 skeleton, even though they're both the minimum level mook monster, and they take about the same amount of effort to kill, but the skeleton has almost no hit points and just an unfairly high amount of resistance. You would think, except for its hit points are so low that it works out because you still kill it really fast. And the zombie has an amount of hit points that is like multiple times as much as a creature of its level should have. But then it's slow and its armor class is terrible and it has massive weaknesses so that you just feel like a hero, even if you're using the right damage type, even if you're like a spellcaster with your dagger and you have no strength. You're like, whoa, my spellcaster just did 8 damage to this thing.
Yeah, and Possibility mentioned Conan couldn't hurt that one wizard until he discovered that he had to smash the mirrors. And you can create situations like that, like we were talking about earlier, with hazards, where if you write a hazard that has a reaction that gives the wizard at the boss a damage reduction against an attack, and then it keeps using that reaction to deflect the blows until you disable the hazard and stop it from doing that. That's another way to kind of create that memorable encounter that's maybe more about the hazard than it was about the specific creature.
Yeah, it doesn't even have to be a hazard. Like when
Mm-hmm.
last time when Jess talked about hazards, and then I generalized it to be like you
Mm-hmm.
can have elements on the battlefield that you interact with in some way to take down a buff. Well, that buff could be some weird mirror buff that lets the enemy
Mm-hmm.
sort of mirror image out of attacks. And it's like, yeah, if I smash the mirror, then it weakens their mirror defense until once all the mirrors are gone, they lose it entirely. That's totally a way you could do it. You could have a giant barrier that there are pillars or weaker minions that are like sustaining the barrier, and then it's like, well, these minions are barely doing anything to us. And they actually are weirdly defensive for their level because they have almost no offense and all their specs are being hard to kill. But they're putting a barrier on the boss and making it harder to kill the boss. So maybe what do I do? Should I just focus on the boss, the one who's actually hurting us, or should we divert some effort to fight down those minions so that we can break the barrier and it'll be a cinch to defeat the boss once that barrier is down? It leads to
Definitely.
options, choices, and when you make your players engage with choices instead of just doing their general routine where they're like,
Mm-hmm.
we figured out our best routine, just like the dragon has one, your players might too. We're going to use this every fight if we can. Any fight that makes them not use that because they have to think and do something else is more likely to be memorable with that creature. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
the entire set of creatures where it's like, yeah, I charge in and smash them, and then you blast them, we debuff them, we give this buff onto the team, that anytime it's the exact same thing as usual, they'll kind of blend together more.
Yeah. It's good, in my opinion, for a monster to have a routine because you're using that monster once. Whereas it's good to bring the players out of that routine because they need to play that character in every combat.
Exactly. And so, but even then, having the monster's routine does not mean that it gets to do the routine. That's just what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
The players may absolutely, your players are probably sneaky jackals who are going to find a way to mess up the monster's routine, and that's lovely and brilliant because that's also fun for them. When the times that they mess up them, they can figure out what the routine is, and they put a monkey wrench in it and stop you from doing it. Like
And then
just
they'll feel good about that.
they'll feel lovely. Like Jess gave the example
Yeah.
about a creature that needs to spend all its 3 actions in Pathfinder 2 to do something. Let's
Mm-hmm.
say it wasn't one that was so vulnerable, like her example of it attacks a ton of things, but it can't move. But let's say it's
Mm-hmm.
actually a very standard 3 action ability of a trample, where it moves a lot and it probably will hit your whole party in a small area because it's moving as part of the ability and does lots of damage to everybody. Well, guess what? Even though it has the ability to move, if you trip it first or
Mm-hmm.
slow it down, it won't have enough actions to use that trample.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah,
if
that's
you,
one of the. Oh, sorry. Continue.
yeah, if your players know it has the trample, perhaps it used the trample already and it's gonna use it
Mm-hmm.
again, and then they counterplay to stop it from using trample, especially if the trample's its main ability. It feels so good to be like, we broke the trample. It never could trample us
Mm-hmm.
again.
Yeah, that's one of the risks of putting like all of your design eggs into a 3 action ability on a creature is that if that creature gets slowed or tripped or anything like that, now it just kind of has nothing else to use.
That's right. So there's some 5e notes that I see in chat about how like attack bonus is so much better than bonus to damage in 5e.
Mhm.
You know what? That's been a classic issue on like plus weapons that gave +1 to hit and damage for most editions of D&D. And so that's why in Pathfinder, one of the reasons, the other of which being the fact that like whether your weapon is a D6 plus 70 or a D8 plus 70, you don't care once it's plus 70. That caused us in Pathfinder to take out a lot of the bonus damage that existed before in Pathfinder 2 and put it into giving you more dice of the weapon's die. So your enchanted weapon doesn't just give you +3 to hit and +3 to damage. It gives you +3 to hit and 3 additional dice of damage. So your D12 and your D4, instead of being only 4 apart by the end of the game, if you have 4 dice of them, they're actually 16 apart in damage, which is a huge amount.
Do we have other questions?
So I have tried to hit all the questions we've had. Obviously, if you super chat, I will automatically get your question. Otherwise, I may just pick up ones that I happen to notice that seem interesting. And I think we caught them. We answered the questions. Yeah. We told you how to make your monsters interesting. And again, I don't think your monsters aren't interesting. Only the thumbnail and the title that Steven put in think that about your monsters.
Only Steven thinks that, but Steven isn't here.
Steven thinks your monsters aren't interesting. I think your monsters are interesting, but they could be even more interesting. And hopefully with these tips, you're going to make them even more interesting. So if you do, and you use some of these tips to focus on what can happen, I'm just going to summarize. Focus on what can happen during the rounds. Come up with a routine. Even if it gets broken, that's great. You at least had something you wanted to do. Treat the monster as the main course and create garnishes and spices that are other things that emphasize the monster rather than overshadowing it, assuming that the monster is the main course, of course. Tell us how you use these tips and tactics to create memorable monsters in your game, and if it did create a really cool experience, tell us in the comments. And of course, if you did this and it's like, well, now it was actually the least memorable monster ever, even though we followed your tips, you can tell us that in the comments too. It might be instructive or lead to a good and interesting sort of way of figuring out why it fell flat or went wrong. And of course, do like and subscribe. It looks like we have a percentage of likes that is higher compared to the number of people watching than has sometimes been the case when Steven tells people, do you have thumbs? So we don't have to say that.
What's going on? Don't you have thumbs?
We don't have to say that, though. We have a good percentage. They do have thumbs. They do have thumbs.
Have... We have proof. We have proof of thumb.
Proof of thumb. All right. So there is a question that looks like it is here. A couple more. So, what is the one thing that could easily improve a mediocre monster? Like the equivalent to like the spice that you have as a chef that is your secret sauce that you throw on everything just in case to take a dish from mediocre to good.
Yeah, understanding the context of what you actually want to achieve with this monster is really important. If the monster has an ability that you want it to use in front of the players, and that's the thing that makes it interesting, then you need to make sure that conditions are right to use that ability. If it doesn't have any abilities that you want it to use in front of the players, if you look at it and think like, there's not really anything compelling that it's going to do in combat that is going to make the players take notice, like it kind of just like has strikes and maybe like a pounce, then change the monster, make it a ghost. Do something else to it. Give it a unique ability that is going to be the kind of showstopper, oh shit moment when the players are fighting it. Or give it something else on the battlefield to interact with so that the kind of mediocre abilities that it has are elevated and made even scarier thanks to the terrain or thanks to the hazard or thanks to the other creatures that are also in the combat.
Yeah, I think that's right. Basically, give it a high conceptual through line, and it might only take one ability to do that. It might take more, but the quick, easy fix is if you see a muddled monster and you're like, I don't know what's going on here. They gave it 12 abilities. What am I going to do? If you create a conceptual through line, yes, this might clobber some of the 12 abilities they gave it, and you wind up not using those because you're doing your through line, but I think that's not a problem. If anything, that could be an added additional benefit for you. Mm-hmm. So I agree.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Identify what your objective with this creature is.
Exactly. Identify your objective and then follow that through line wherever it goes. Like, what is your concept? What do you want the creature to do? So then the other question that I'm seeing here is... Actually, there's a couple more now. So there's a question about regional effects of the creatures that are it's like you're fighting this ice monster, and so all extreme cold saves are more difficult, or issues where like Coven harms intruders who come into their lair, or other things like that. So I think regional effects as well as lair actions, where there's like extra actions that the creature can use in their lair, are an interesting mechanic in 5e that lets you do something similar to what we were talking about with these hazards that and complex hazards that are thrown into encounters in Pathfinder 2. In fact, I would even say that I think that giving it a name of something like lair action, which I know they're moving away from actually doing nowadays, but in 2024, but I thought that was good. It follows the Rumpelstiltskin principle, which is a principle that was named, as far as I know, by my advisor back at MIT, who basically was, if you name something, you get power over that thing. Just like Rumpelstiltskin, where you had his name, and then that allowed you to defeat him. And so by giving lair actions a name, even though like there's a concept of doing something like that in Pathfinder 2, but it doesn't have like a specific name like lair action that's snappy, it automatically makes people think about them more, or regional effects. And so I do like that they have specific name, because that inherently makes it easier to think about using them.
Anything in the kind of hazard zone, I am a fan of.
Yeah, definitely. Because they just add a nice spice to the encounter that lets you do something different than just damage a lot of the time.
And especially because Pathfinder 2 is mainly what I know. So if you're building a Pathfinder 2 encounter, having some of the encounter budget be a hazard helps a lot with managing how many things are on the battlefield at one time, and making the battle more tense and more difficult for the players without adding more pieces to move around and more things that need to fit on the map, or making the boss another level higher.
That's right. All right. Well, I think we answered the questions there. That's awesome. Everybody, thanks for joining us. I hope you learned some interesting things about monsters, and maybe about Project Sigil. It's very sad what happened there, but I guess it's sort of Wizards back to business as usual in terms of things like layoffs. So
yeah,
next week,
it's just the reality of like a publicly traded company.
Yeah, the companies are not your friend, even though some of the people who work at the companies might literally be your friend. Look, I'm friends with people who went on to work at Wizards of the Coast. They're awesome. Every person I know who works there on creative stuff is fantastic. I literally don't know
fantastic.
Don't know anyone who isn't.
They're fantastic, and I worry constantly for their jobs.
Yes.
Yeah.
That just sort of is what it is. So next week, Steven will be back, and we also have Kelsey Dion of Shadow Dark fame. So you don't want to miss it, especially if you like the episodes that have Steven and Kelsey in them. And I guess that's about it. There's some questions in chat. What happened with Sigil? Go back to the beginning of the episode. We covered it as a mini topic back then. So, all right, everyone. Take care. And have a good week. We will see you next time. Oh, and don't forget to back Living Legends. That's right. Kickstarter.rollforcombat.com. Surprisingly, or no, maybe Stream Elements was telling people to do that during... No, I think it did already. And it said you could download Swarm Bloods for free, which Jas wrote. So, good work, Stream Elements. You already have been linking that in the chat, but I did not say it out loud for people who are not looking at the chat. So, check it out.
Yep.
And we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
And if you want to battle the zoo, don't forget to roll for combat.
That's right.
Yep.